With taxi operations coming to a halt and commuters that left stranded, tensions between the Western Cape government and the taxi leadership are reaching boiling point. Joining us now to analyse the impact of these developments and potential solutions is independent analyst Khaya Sithole. Khaya, I appreciate your time this evening. It really is a nasty situation that Cape Town is experiencing, but I suppose what's also common to this is that it periodically happens across the country.
Yes, good evening to your viewers. So, yeah, I think the relationships between the state, commuters, and the taxi industry have historically been subject to tension points that occasionally flare up. And I think, obviously, in previous years, the voices for the flare-up could have been on issues relating to the setting of fares and the regulation of routes. And in this particular instance, it's also obviously seems to be driven by the question of what law enforcement wants to do and how it wants to apply it. So I don't think anyone is surprised that there are these particular tensions, but the big problem is obviously that there isn't a very clear policy direction on how the state wants to regulate and interact with the sector, given how central it is in the practice of getting commuters to move across the cities every single day.
Well, the question would be, what is the relationship between government and the taxi industry? Is there a formalized relationship? I mean, when you look at the numerous challenges that are repeatedly occurring, one would anticipate that there would be open two-way communication between the various parties.
So look, in South Africa, obviously, taxis are actually still an element of private enterprise. So they're actually private vehicles that simply happen to play an important role in getting the public to be mobile around every part of the country. So, of course, in South Africa, we do know that the public transportation systems, whether it is trains that, are run by the state, for example, those on their own quite simply do not have the reach that the taxis have, and we also do not have the reliability that some taxis might have simply because of the volume of taxis that we have. So you are not going to end up with a situation where we can only work with one transport, system versus another. It's always been very important to be able to ensure that we have a system that enables both the taxi industry to operate and also, where possible, the state facilities, whether it's in the form of PRASA, for example, to be able to operate. It's also quite clear that in the South African context, South Africa's government is probably unlikely to ever be able to put up the type of train infrastructure that you see in other countries of the world, where essentially every citizen is a few meters away from the next train stop. So that's not going to happen. And if that's not going to happen, it means that taxis are going to remain a fundamental part of the transport value chain. The problem, of course, is that because taxis are a private enterprise, it's not always been clear to figure out what type of relationship the state ought to have with them. So generally, when there is a free market, the state comes in as a regulator. So the state will say, we're responsible for the licensing of taxis, we are responsible for the licensing of routes, for example, and that's where our responsibility ends. However, when things go wrong, when there are problems, because of the effect and the impact on citizens at large, the state cannot sit it out and say, well, the free market must sort itself out. And that's what we're seeing here, where it's clear that the state cannot be idle. It has to particularly participate in this conversation. And I think in the Cape Town case study, we probably haven't found the right model of that particular coordination, which is why you're seeing this suspension of taxes that has been announced.
So let's look at the common problems with taxi associations in the various provinces. Is there a common thread to these problems, or does each province seem to have its own set of problems?
I think on an anecdotal basis, the key issue, of course, the question of who is responsible for what. And I think the question of responsibility is usually best answered by formalized structures. So if there are going to be taxi associations that operate in a particular city, what are the rules of engagement? How does one get their taxi to be part of the fleet or the chain? And in instances where there are clearly problems, perhaps in relation to the quality of the vehicles and the safety of the vehicles, what recourse do the passengers have, and what influence does the state have in ensuring that passengers are not exposed? So I think in the absence of a very clear plan on how that ought to work in different places, it then becomes a mixed bag where perhaps in some of the bigger cities, because of the number of people involved and because of the number of associations and owners involved, they may gravitate towards saying, guys, let us create particular rules of engagement so that everybody knows what the limitations and what, the rules are. And in other places where perhaps the market isn't that deep, you may find that they don't have those types of structures in place. So that simply means that every single instance has to be evaluated on its own basis. And we do know that sometimes some of the issues are internal within the industry itself. So association one wants to run a particular route, and another association thinks, no, that's a lucrative route that we want to run. So you've got those internal conflicts that occasionally flare up there. But you also have got the conflicts with perhaps that dimension of law enforcement, where taxi owners and taxi drivers feel that perhaps law enforcement is going a bit too aggressively in trying to manage the sector. And then there's also the reality that in all of this, it is the consumers that seem to have the least amount of power. So very few of us are in a position to say, no, I'm getting into a taxi rank. I do not like what it looks like. So therefore, please put me onto the next one, because it's simply not a model that enables us to bargain our way through it. So I think until we fix all of those things, until we can say that, look, every single taxi that's part of a particular transport value chain has been vetted properly, it ensures the safety of consumers, you are going to see these particular problems. But also the conduct of law enforcement and how they approach it is also a matter of great contention, because clearly the scenes that we saw from Cape Town today cannot possibly be how law enforcement is supposed to operate.
Well, I want to talk a little bit more about Cape Town. A little while ago, Faraday Taxi Association chairman said that there were new bylaws that were introduced by the City of Cape Town, but no one in the taxi industry was made aware of these bylaws.
That's an interesting one, because what is supposed to happen in any form of law, development of the law, you need to be able to consult with the affected stakeholders. It is quite foolhardy to develop any set of rules and regulations without consulting those that are going to be primarily affected by it, because then you may end up with the type of rules that are not conducive to the type of issues that you think you're trying to resolve. So, of course, until the City of Cape Town comes out and says, well, actually, in the process of drafting these regulations, in the process of debating them, this is who we consulted, and this is why we think it represents the intersection of the multiple voices and the multiple stakeholders that should have been in the room, we actually cannot answer the question of whether they've completely ignored the consultation process, or whether it's simply a matter of not enough people, or not enough people of particular clout were consulted in the particular process. It may well be that you and I didn't hear about it, but other people and other stakeholders heard about it. So until we get some clarity on what the process of developing them was, and also the implementation plan, and also quite importantly, the fact that clearly these are the type of bylaws that are going to create an element of disruption, whether it was going to be them simply seamlessly taking out some of the taxes from the value chain, which simply means that you and I that thought there'd be 10 taxes by the time we need to head home, but there's only 5. There were always going to be elements of disruption, so not just a violent manifestation. So what was the city's position on, well, what if we get to a particular route and 80% of the taxes that we find them are found to be unroadworthy and want to take them out of circulation at that particular point in time? How will the consumers be able to get home? So these are the things that you would have expected to be part of, the well thought out plan of implementation, to say, these are the bylaws, this is the time of implementation, and this is how we're going to deal with what happens to everyone else who's actually affected by the sector. And I think there's clearly been a lack of connection in that particular conversation.
Now, the taxi industry has many intricacies that I'd imagine anybody who's dealing with the industry would have to understand. Do you get the impression that the Western Cape government is unaware or ignorant of some of these intricacies?
Look, I do not think they can plead ignorance, because, again, when it comes to matters of public policy and public governance, it is difficult to imagine that one can simply plead that they didn't understand the type of market they were trying to regulate, or the type of market for whom they're trying to write the rules. So I don't think that's a very strong argument. What may be an issue is perhaps a lack of understanding on what the embrace of these new steps was going to be from the industry itself. So you have to be able to then ask yourself the question that, well, if we then put these rules together, if we put these particular guidelines together, what response do we expect to get from them, and how do we then validate the decisions that we take? And I think when you then found yourself wanting, when you're not in a position to explain the rationale for the decisions and the legitimacy of the decisions, you then create this accountability vacuum where others simply say, well, we didn't even know that the rules of engagement had changed. And then the city itself is like, well, even if the rules of engagement hadn't changed, our duties as law enforcement are to do X, Y, Z. So you're now speaking past each other rather than asking the simple questions of what is the problem statement. And if the problem statement is that we've got a safety problem within the taxi industry, then that is something that definitely must be tackled. But in the process of tackling it, you don't want to alienate those that have a material interest in the industry, because whether you and I like it or not, we do know that there are elements of criminality that have been that occasionally infiltrate and have been associated with the taxi industry. So it would have been foolhardy for any law enforcement or for any public official to simply pretend that these realities do not exist, particularly when you're dealing with this industry.
Khaya Sithole, independent analyst, and packing for us the saga around Cape Town taxi industry. Appreciate your time this evening.